All right, what's going on, everyone? Today we're going to take a look at some updates around the ongoing war in Gaza. Overnight, Israel says that they killed a senior Hamas leader in an airstrike, but for my opinion, it's less about who they killed and more about where they killed him. So for an idea of that, we'll pull up a map. This is Live View, a map, a publicly available resource, starting zoomed out, looking at all of Israel. Now, there has been a fair amount of activity on the northern border between Hezbollah and the IDF over the past couple days, but today we're going to focus in on the Gaza Strip, the southwestern portion of Israel that's taking up all of the map here. Now, later in this video, we're going to talk about some pretty notable changes in the Rafah operation down here in the south, but the senior Hamas leader that was killed overnight was killed up here in the northern portion of the strip, about as far north as you can get in Beit Hanun, which is notable because these are areas that the IDF at least partially moved through a few months ago. Now, according to IDF statements, they say they killed the deputy commander of Hamas's national security forces in the Gaza Strip, who goes by the name of Deya al-Din al-Sharafa. And apologies for that pronunciation. There's going to be a couple more in this video that I'm not super confident on. Al-Sharafa, they say, was responsible for overseeing the forces that secured the Gaza Strip's borders. During the war, these forces prevented the civilian population from evacuating from combat zones. Additionally, they say that another senior Hamas leader by the name of Youssef al-Shibaki was killed in Gaza City. So also here in the northern portion of the Gaza Strip, they say al-Shibaki was responsible for the industrial equipment department of Hamas. So the operation, research, and manufacture of weapon systems like some of their homegrown systems like rockets, sniper rifles, IEDs, etc. So we have two senior Hamas leaders killed in the past 24 hours, one up here back to the map, one up here in Beit Hanun, about as far north as you can get in the Gaza Strip, and the other here in Gaza City, right in the central portion of the northern Gaza Strip. Again, notable because Israel has previously moved through these areas, and it's been clear now for quite a while that Hamas has re-infiltrated some of those areas. Now, Hamas has claimed responsibility for 16 attacks across the Gaza Strip over the past few days, which is a bit of an uptick. Not as many as we saw right when the Rafah operation kicked off, but still, Hamas and the Qassam brigades, the militant wing of Hamas, is very, very active as of late. Included in these statements, Hamas says that they targeted multiple Israeli foot patrols as well as tanks with RPGs. They said they blew up a tunnel that had been booby-trapped, and it's something we're hearing from Israeli forces as well, is just about every single tunnel they come across has at least one explosive device either in the tunnel or at the entrance. Booby traps to kill Israeli soldiers as they move into these tunnel networks. Now, the reason they're moving into these tunnels is not exclusively to root out Hamas, but as we're going to get into here in just a moment, there's a lot of hostages, dead hostages for now, being found in these tunnel networks. So when Israel moves down underground to try to recover their dead citizens, they're coming across booby traps designed to kill them in the process. Additionally, Hamas put out a statement saying that they ambushed an Israeli force, and then during the rescue attempt, whether those were infantry, maybe engineers, depending on the location, or medical personnel who came in to evacuate the wounded and dead Israeli soldiers, Hamas says they targeted them as well. And this also happened north of Beit Hanun. Again, about as far north in the Gaza Strip as you can possibly get. So it's not just that Hamas leaders are now all across the Gaza Strip, still coming under fire from Israeli forces, but you also have rather complex attacks playing out in areas that the IDF has previously moved through. Now, we did get news yesterday that 3 more Israeli hostages have been recovered, or the bodies of those hostages have been recovered during the course of an overnight operation in Jabalia. Back to the map here to give you an idea of the area we're looking at. Jabalia has seen pretty significant fighting in the past couple weeks. This is where some of the most intense fights, street to street, house to house, have been taking place between Hamas and the IDF. This is Jabalia here. It's an area that mostly the IDF moved through a couple months ago. Of course, Hamas has re-infiltrated, and the IDF is moving back through. Now, in this statement put out by the IDF, they said that Orion Hernandez, 30 years old, as well as Hanan Yablaka, 42 years old, and Michael Niesenbaum, 59, were recovered. The bodies of those 3 gentlemen were recovered during this operation, but they were all killed on October 7th. However, it doesn't sound like Israel or their families knew that, right? It wasn't until they uncovered the bodies of these 3 hostages that they found out that they had actually died months ago. Those 3 hostages were recovered, the bodies were recovered, and subsequently moved back into Israel. Now, that leaves around 125 hostages remaining in Gaza. In the last couple weeks here, there's been, I want to say 7, maybe as many as 10 bodies of hostages recovered from inside of the Gaza Strip. And for one, that's tragic for the families, of course, right? Nothing trumps that at all. From the Hamas side, this is their bargaining chip. And we're starting to see more and more evidence that there might not be very many of these hostages still alive. We really aren't seeing any sort of proof of life, recent proof of life videos coming out of Hamas. So there's a lot of concern that of those 125 still remaining to be rescued, how many are actually alive? And as we saw in the recent round of negotiations between Israel and Hamas, ceasefire negotiations, Hamas had a hard time coming up with enough living hostages to meet the criteria for that arrangement. But of course, that remains a centerpiece of Israeli operations as they continue to push back into the north as well as further south in Rafah. Now, moving over to Rafah, this is the southern portion of the Gaza Strip. A lot of focus. I've seen signs saying like all eyes on Rafah. There's a couple reasons for this, and there's a reason that it's important to both sides in this conflict. It's strangely complex. We haven't really gotten into a lot of this before, but from the Israeli side, they view Rafah as kind of the last holdout. This is an area where there's likely a lot of Israeli hostages, as well as senior Hamas leadership, and Israel has said there's as many as 4 Hamas battalions still operating, or still functional, I should say, in the Rafah area. And this seems to be true based off the level of combat we're seeing come out from that area. From the Palestinian side, there's a lot of concern, and this is mirrored around the world, that as civilians have been displaced from the north, they've been forced to move south, and now they're all co-located in and around Rafah. Displaced people, internally displaced people with nowhere else to go, and any sort of military operation in that area is going to be, surrounded by innocent civilians. It could lead to significant, not only civilian death, but make it harder for the civilians to receive any sort of medical or humanitarian aid. So it's very important to both parties in a lot of ways. And then, of course, to Hamas, it's important because it's probably where their senior leaders are. At this point, after Israel has moved through so much of the Gaza Strip, if there's any senior leaders still remaining inside of Gaza and they did not flee through the Rafah crossing, and more on that here in a second, or underneath the Rafah crossing, they're probably in Rafah. So there's a lot of reasons why Hamas does not want Israel to go in there either. Now, just yesterday, the ICJ, International Court of Justice, who is hearing the current genocide case brought forward by South Africa, issued a ruling or a statement saying that Israel must immediately halt its military offensive and any other action in Rafah, which may inflict on the Palestinian group in Gaza's conditions of life that could bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. So the ICJ is tying the operation in Rafah to this overall genocide case, saying, Israel, stop. Do not go into Rafah. Now, that's been met with a wide range of responses that we'll get into here in a second. But I just want to step back and say how crazy it is that in the middle of a war, there's a court somewhere saying, hey, military, you can't go to X place to complete the objectives of this war. Now, I know it's not a one-to-one comparison, and you can pick holes in this example left and right. I got it. But what comes to mind is as the Allies are surrounding Berlin at the end of World War II, if some international body would have said, hey, wait a second, there's a lot of civilians still in Berlin. We're starting to hear some pretty awful stories about the humanitarian conditions there. I think we're going to direct nobody moves into Berlin. Americans stay west, Soviets stay east, nobody move into Berlin. We'd be up in arms, right? Like Hitler's still there. The focal points of the Nazi leadership are in Berlin, still functioning, still issuing orders up until the last couple of days there. It's hard to imagine that we would have said, okay, got it, we'll just stay here on the outskirts. But Hitler, you guys just recognize that you've been defeated, right? So again, I know it's not a perfect one-to-one comparison. There's a lot of issues with drawing those comparisons. But either way, it's strange that in the middle of a war, there's a court telling a military where they can and cannot go as they try to accomplish their objectives. So then looking at some of the reactions coming out of this, of course, Hamas welcomed the decision as to be expected, calling on the Zionist occupation forces to end its military aggression on Rafah. Opposition leader inside of Israel, Yair Lapid, said, quote, the fact that the court in The Hague did not make the connection in its ruling between the cessation of fighting in Rafah and the return of the hostages and Israel's right to defend itself against terrorism is a moral collapse and moral disaster. This is something, there's been times throughout this conflict and past where people get upset that one side isn't condemned or the other. And I think sometimes there's just some posturing being done there and it's maybe not as important as people make it out to be. But this is one where I feel like there's actually a pretty good argument. Like, hey, if you're going to tell Israel not to go into Rafah, where they think, 100 plus of their citizens are still being held captive by a terrorist organization, you should probably at least call on the other organization to release those innocent civilians, right? It is a little bit surprising that hasn't made its way into the language here yet. Now, Israeli War Cabinet Minister Benny Gantz said, quote, "The state of Israel is committed to continue fighting to return its hostages and promise the security of its citizens, wherever and whenever necessary, including Rafah." And that's the theme. Shouldn't come as a shock to anybody. Israel is not planning on stopping in Rafah anytime soon. Now, an interesting one here came from Egypt, where their foreign ministry said they call on Israel to comply with its legal obligations within the framework of the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide and International Humanitarian Law, and to implement all interim measures issued by the ICJ. And Egypt recently has kind of jumped on board this ICJ case brought forward by South Africa against Israel. And in some cases, it might be surprising, but there's also a lot of thoughts here, going back to the map, that as Israel moves across Rafah, it's entirely likely, there's some speculation, I should say, that Israel's going to start uncovering tunnel networks leading into Egypt that Egypt is at the very least turning a blind eye to. Again, I want to say that is speculation right now, but there's been some arguments that one of the reasons that Egypt is getting so antsy about this whole operation and pushing back so much on Israel moving into Rafah is that once the IDF gets down in here and starts finding look at how much they still haven't moved into, right? About half of Rafah is yet to be under any sort of control by the IDF. And, what if they start finding 10, 20, 30, 50 tunnels that are big enough and wide enough and show some sort of evidence that Egypt has, again, at the very least been turning a blind eye, if not have politicians or leaders within the organization or the military somewhat complicit in allowing the funneling of equipment, maybe even weapons and food into the Gaza Strip. So interesting to see that Egypt comes out in favor of the ICJ here. And then U.S. Senator Lindsey Graham didn't pull any punches. He said, "As far as I'm concerned, the ICJ can go to hell. It's long past time to stand up to these so-called international justice organizations associated with the UN. Their anti-Israel bias is overwhelming. The ICJ's ruling that Israel should stop operations that are necessary to destroy 4 battalions of Hamas killers and terrorists who use Palestinians as human shields is ridiculous. This will and should be ignored by Israel." And again, that's kind of the major takeaway here. I wouldn't put too much weight in the ICJ ruling that Israel should not go into Rafah and should pull troops out of there. It just doesn't seem like that's going to happen. Doesn't seem like that is happening. And it doesn't seem like there's enough international pressure from Israel's allies to really pay much attention to that at all. Again, maybe that changes if we start to see some sort of talks about more hostages coming out and being sent back to Israel as some sort of negotiated settlement to prevent Israel from moving further into Rafah. But that does not appear to be on the table for now. But that's all I got for now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.